living with a purpose. Living with a purpose. Before we can decide the purpose of life, that is, how to live this life, we must evaluate life itself. That is, we must know the goal of life, otherwise our purpose may be different from what it should be. So first we must evaluate this life in which we find ourselves, and then, having the proper goal of life, then we must act. We may know theoretically what the goal of life is. We may have a perfect intellectual understanding of it. But unless we follow that intellectual understanding with right action, then we will not have the right purpose of life. We cannot. We must know the goal of life first, and then we can purpose our life as it should be. And so the goal of life is what? The goal of life is to return home to God consciously, to elevate our human consciousness to the divinity within us, to speed up, so to speak, the vibration of our mind and our consciousness, that we register and then manifest divinity. And so we must first have the right hypothesis of this life. And if that is right, and we follow it with action, the end must be right. But if our hypothesis is false, then the action which follows it also will give a false result. That's why Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of heaven. Seek first that, and all other things will be added unto you. And so, in this earthly existence, the purpose of life, according to our idea of the goal of life, will either be to lay up worldly treasures or to lay up spiritual treasures. The purpose of life for many people is varied. You know, there are all sorts of people in the world. They all have certain purposes in life. Many want to lay up money, lay up wealth, name, and fame, and some have funny little ideas about the purpose of life. Some are very liberal, some are very economically minded. I remember one time a fellow was talking to me, a gentleman, and I wouldn't do something he wanted him to do, and he said that I was mean. He said, you've probably got the first nickel you ever earned. So that was his idea, I guess, of living. It wasn't mine, but it showed what his purpose of life was. It showed his nature, so to speak. And so we find this throughout life. Many people are living so as to lay up worldly treasures. And that idea of living the purpose varies tremendously. I know one gentleman. He was economically minded. He was noted for his thrift. And I guess that was his purpose in life, was to save money and to save things. And so when he walked, he used to take extra long steps so as to save his shoes. But he found in so doing, he split his pants. So economy, if you practice it, it's a great thing. But be sure it isn't false economy, as the gentleman found out. And so life is filled with all sorts of these things, and there are many purposes in life. You analyze the people and you'll see what their purpose is. It is in either of these two categories of laying up worldly advantages and treasure, or to the wise who lay up spiritual treasures. Spiritual treasures where things are not lost as worldly things pass away. And so let us first examine the goal of life. The goal of life is what? To regain To regain, I say, the Garden of Eden. To regain that. We had that. We were in the Garden of Eden. We had that. To regain the paradise of spiritual consciousness is the right translation. If you could feel the spiritual consciousness within yourselves as you did in meditation this morning, always. That's the paradise of spiritual consciousness. Sitting right here with you all, and I know many of you felt it. Such a peace, such a satisfaction, such a contentment. We felt why? Because we were in that paradise of spiritual consciousness to varying degrees from which we have come. We have lost it. We had it. As it says in Ezekiel, the 28th chapter, the 13th, 14th, and 15th verses. It says that we had the paradise of spiritual consciousness, but we have lost it. For there we read, "Thou hast been in Eden. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God." The holy mountain of God is what? It's the seat of spiritual consciousness in you and in me. It is that region of the brain, the subtle brain, the spiritual brain, in the head, that is called the holy mountain because that's the seat of spiritual consciousness, most holy. We had that. Then it goes on to say, "Thou wast upon the holy mountain. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire." The stones of fire refers to the centers of the spine, the spiritual centers of the spine, of which you read in our Master's autobiography. Those are the seats of spiritual consciousness. Those plus the supreme center in the brain constitutes the Garden of Eden, constitutes the paradise of spiritual consciousness from which we have fallen. Why did we fall? Well, thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created. Don't you think we're children of God? Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. Until delusion got hold of us. Until we felt ourselves separated from God. That's the only delusion. That's the sin. That's the original sin, that we forgot our oneness with God. And so we were perfect until iniquity was found in thee. Therefore, I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God and out of the stones of fire. It could not be any clearer. We had the spiritual consciousness. We have lost it through what? Attachment. Attachment to worldly living and to these external things of which I have been speaking. We have lost that which we have had. And because of it, because we feel separated from God, we have lost the consciousness of the holy mountain and the spine, the deep spine, where God and his angels dwell. That's the Garden of Eden. Of course, I know in Asia Minor, years ago, I think it was very fertile there. It was perhaps spoken of as the Garden of Eden. But there might just as well be robbers and thieves and all sorts of people in that garden. The real Garden of Eden is right within ourselves, in the spiritual consciousness of the presence of God. So let us not forget that. And then from Master's own writings in his lessons, we read this to substantiate what I have said. The key to the land of luminosity is where? That is, how can we find it? We can find it by following one who had that consciousness of the Garden of Eden. He saw and knew and lived in the region of luminosity, which is spiritual light, and we perceive it at times in our deep meditations. For he says, by concentrating the vision between the eyebrows, the devotee can switch off at will the motion pictures of this earthly existence. As we look straight ahead, we have worldly consciousness. When we close our eyes, we have subconsciousness. When we elevate our eyes, as we do in meditation, to this point, we have superconsciousness. And having that superconsciousness, the motion pictures of this external world disappear. Then he goes on to say, he then can launch his consciousness into the land of luminosity, the land of the fourth dimension, the land of intuition, the land of which the saint in the 14th century said that no man can of God think. You cannot think of God, he's above that. But by the intuition of the soul, which is the great force of attraction of God's love, you can easily, through affection for God, secure him and hold him. There we have the answer. Self-realization gives those techniques which make it quite easy, if you mean business with God, to know these things. So there you have two testimonies of what the goal of life is to return to that from which we have fallen, a paradise of spiritual consciousness, right within each and every one of us, the land of the luminous presence of God's great consciousness in us as the Christ consciousness. Same consciousness as God the Father. In or away from this creation, it is known as the great Father. In the creation, it is known as the Son or the Christ consciousness. It is in the Word, the holy vibration. There we find God. And if we can hear that holy vibration through the sixth sense, you do not hear it with these ears, through the sixth sense of intuition, then you will see the land of luminosity. You will feel, greatest of all, the presence of God, his great love, unending, all-pervading. Wouldn't that be a Garden of Eden? That's the land of spiritual consciousness. That's the goal of life. If you have that as your goal, then you can easily see your purpose of life will to do those actions whereby you bring into fulfillment this land of spiritual consciousness, right within us, within each one of us. Now, to do this, we must distinguish between real and unreal things of life. Happiness, ordinary happiness, or freedom in God. Ordinary happiness, you know, is the relief from a mind that is in turmoil, from a racing, uncontrolled mind. If you can still that mind, there's a great relief comes. That's known as peace of mind. But that's not the positive aspect of the presence of God. That's the negative aspect. But after you attain that peace of mind through the practice of self-realization techniques, then you can go forward and attain the positive aspect of the presence of God, or his peace and bliss. You can practice, as Brother Lawrence did, practice the presence of God. But how can you practice it with a racing mind? A mind in which the thoughts run you instead of you running the thoughts. It's impossible. But by following the Master's way, his techniques, you can attain first the peace of mind. Then, by fully surrendering to God, you can attain positive companionship with him, and you can live one with him. There's no separation then. While there's a separation, you will never be satisfied. I will never be satisfied, because we had his consciousness in the Garden of Eden. We had it. But because we have been attached to this worldly living, we have lost it. We have to once more attain it. And so, this is so. That is, we have to distinguish because we have temptation with us, because we have two natures. One is material, the other is spiritual. One of our natures is human. We are subject to the laws of attachment to this earthly existence because one of our aspects is human. We are human beings, but we are also spiritual beings. And if we can distinguish between those things which will be laid up in this earthly consciousness, if we can distinguish between those and also those things which will be laid up in the spiritual consciousness, or the spiritual Garden of Eden, so to speak, if we can distinguish them, then we will act so that our treasures will be of lasting quality, not of transient quality of this worldly existence. That is the first thing that we have to learn, and we must learn. Because in this consciousness, this earthly consciousness, we lay up treasures no matter what we have, money, houses, position, name, and fame. We will not be satisfied because there can be no permanent happiness. Why? Because transient consciousness, worldly consciousness passes away. We see it every day. Even we see it in sleep if you'll just observe. You give up everything, name and fame and all sorts of things. But there is within you a permanent treasure of peace and bliss. If you will practice a little, you can follow it through sleep. Anyway, in the morning when you wake up, you'll know when you had good contact with God because you slept well and you feel real rested in the morning. You lifted your eyes unconsciously to this point and you passed into the Garden of Eden, perhaps in an unconscious way. But by meditation, practicing the techniques which Master has left, you can do it consciously. You can do it consciously. Then you know that spiritual consciousness exists and is. So we must understand to distinguish between these things, because true happiness and fulfillment cannot be found in outward consciousness. It is of the soul. Because the soul is of a nature of God. It is a ray of God. The soul is an atom of spirit. What is God? Our Master says there is no question of a doubt. Bliss consciousness is God consciousness. In meditation you all feel that, more or less. Make it more, until finally you will dwell in that. Even coming to church, even going to the factory of work, so to speak, even making the beds, even doing all those things which are so automatic. They become something real because then you do them with one purpose, to please God. Now, great men and women, as well as saints and spiritual leaders, that they may contact the presence of God within, have time to do it, they do away with unnecessary necessities, as the Master used to say. They reduce their needs and thereby simplify their lives, because if you have too much going on, too many engagements of a worldly nature, it'll be impossible for you to turn your attention wholly to God. You cannot do it. Therefore, great people simplify their needs, that they have more time to lay up spiritual treasures in heaven. That is very necessary. I know I have talked lately with 2 or 3 devotees, and they are trying to simplify their lives and the things they have to do. Why? Because there's no time to feel the peace of God's presence, which they need so much, and which we all need. Now, the wise people, spiritual leaders, do that, and so we should follow their example. In Jesus' words, for instance, Jesus advised us to act so that the end result would be freedom in God. Freedom in God. Freedom does not come from plenty of money in the pocket, plenty of houses to live in, plenty of such things. You will not have the freedom at all. You'll have less freedom by laying up so much of that stuff, because of its nature it is dual. It requires a contrast to feel satisfaction and happiness. While in God, one consciousness, the unity of His presence, gives us fulfillment, perfect peace, and bliss. So that's why Jesus said this. In St. Luke, the 12th chapter, the 21st verse. So he that layeth up treasure for himself is not rich in God. So don't do it. It's all right to be busy. It's all right to make money. We should make money. I find that those who are not busy, they go into delusion. It's all right to make money, but without attachment. Because the moment you are attached to you, as Jesus said, that person is not rich toward God. There'll be no satisfaction. Although as we look about us, it seems money talks, position talks. If you know a certain person, you can get this, you can get that. But you can't get God that way. You've got to know Him to get Him. And you know Him by following one who had Him. as our beloved Master. So, I have one or two other references which I'll give you at this time, pointing out that we must reduce our needs in life, especially we must break attachment to this life. That's the important thing. It's the breaking of the attachment. It is so subtle, because that attachment is there for what purpose? Is to keep this show going, is to keep you tied and to keep me tied to the law of cause and effect, or karmic action. So that's why it is so subtle. That's why it's so difficult to break the attachment for this living. But the one sure thing is, if you taste the presence of God, nothing can stand in your way of breaking the attachment for this worldly living. So great is the pull of God's love. You will be able, without question of it, I don't care what your habit is, if you want God and want God alone and want Him enough, the habit must fall off. That's what your purpose in life should be. That's what mine should be. To contact God, that all of our difficulties, all of our attachments, all of our restlessness be taken away by the love of the infinite Father. That alone will do it. As I spoke about the saint who said, God is not known. No man can know God by thought, but by simple affection for God. Think of it. Just affection for Him. He responds, Master used to say, he responds quickly if you really love Him. Simple affection, He can be secured, and He can be held. He can't get away. We must realize these eternal truths. And so, these few references I will give you and explain that it may help you as we consider this subject. First, Luke the 12th chapter, the 30th to the 34th verse. Master used to say this. I remember so well. I've heard him so often from this very stage. He used to say, and he had a terrific voice when he opened it up. He used to say, bread the men of the world seek after, but rather seek ye the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Then it goes on, for all these things do the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knoweth that they have need of these things. He who has made universe upon universe, don't you think He can feed the different nations of this world? But they don't look at it that way. They try to do it themselves, and the Lord says, go ahead, get into trouble. And they're in trouble. They need one thing, and that is God. All the nations need that one thing. But the delusion is strong. As the Gita says, all men walk the earth wholly deluded. But he also says, get out of my delusion, O Arjuna. Get out of that delusion. If only the leaders would just realize that their nation, all nations, needed one thing, God's love. And if that could enter the hearts of men, peace would come just like that. But all we can do, as Master used to say, we must take sides. We must support the kingdom of God. We must support God's goodness and righteousness, otherwise the kingdom of evil will win. And therefore we cannot say, oh, well, life is like that. We have to do our part. And every one of us, meditating on God is a greater force. Really feeling God's love is a greater force than all the politicians put together. Realize that. That's what we have to do. We read in the scripture about the words that if there were 10 men, if I could find 10 men in Sodom and Gomorrah, I would save the cities. Why? Because 10 good men equal millions of ordinary people working for worldly fulfillment. Such is the power of God. Realize that. Don't think in your meditations you're doing something just irrelevant or something that amounts to nothing. You are doing God's will. Keep on meditating. Let Him flow through you. You will not see how He's doing it, but you will see He is doing it. Such is God's power. No one can follow God. If you try to follow Him, you'll weaken your position because He is the doer. He's the one that's doing it through you. But if you realize that, humbly bow to Him with true humility, you will see His hand working. And as He works, you will feel such a companionship and such a security that nothing can shake you. Such is the power of God, such should be our purpose in life. And so, a little more, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. That is a very important verse. It is your Father's good pleasure. It is not your pleasure. It is not my pleasure. It is not finally the guru's pleasure. It is the grace of God which will give you the kingdom of God. That's why all the great saints, especially Larry DeMarsh's words, come to me at this time when he says, Kriya Yoga will give you the realization of the kingdom of light within and many powers, but that must be followed with full surrender to God. Why? Because it's God's pleasure to give us the kingdom of heaven. Then it goes on, sell that which ye have and give alms. Provide yourselves bags which wax not old, a treasure in the heavens that faileth not, where no thief approacheth, neither moth corrupteth. This does not mean, as it seems to say literally. It simply means if you have attachment for all these things, then you're laying up treasures on earth. But if you perform your duty in life without attachment, you're laying up treasures in heaven. It does not mean, as it says, sell that which ye have. It means if you're attached to it, yes, give it away. It's better to have nothing than to be attached to that which will give you nothing in the end. And so these verses are very important. And finally, one more. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. There comes a time as you meditate when you seem to go over the hump. At first you're climbing up. It's so difficult. You can't get stabilized. But there comes a time when you go over the hump, and then your heart is there. Then it's much easier. But keep on. Don't give up. If you give up where you're going, you won't be satisfied. But I have found that there comes a time when it's much easier. I think God kind of feels bad for us, and he makes it a little easier. But it's still his grace. You can't push him. Master said to me one time, he said, no one, not a saint, can bend God. So we must not try to bend him. We simply have to have a little affection for him. Then you'll see his hand working. And so, likewise, whoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, cannot be my disciple, Jesus said. That is, he means. That does not mean that you take all your stuff and throw it away. That's foolishness. He means he who does not forsake attachment to all the things you have. That's all. For he then goes on to say, for he cannot be my disciple. A disciple of Christ would be what? It would be he who spoke from Christ consciousness or speaks from Christ consciousness as Jesus did. That would be a true disciple. And if you are attached to worldly things, do you think you could stand up and say the things Jesus said? Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not. Jesus was speaking from Christ consciousness. Therefore, if you want to be a true disciple of God, and a true disciple of the channels of God is our Master and the great ones, Jesus, all the great ones. If you want to be true disciples as they have, you must give up attachment for things, that's all. Not those things necessarily, because those things can do good in the world for people who do not have that standard of consciousness which perhaps you have attained. So realize it is the attachment, the fruit of action, that's the sin, not the action which lays up worldly goods. If you use them properly, there's no karma laid up then. It is desire that lays up the karma. If you have desire for more and more things, and keep at it until there's no end of it, then, as the scriptures say, because of that, you are considered profane and have been cast out of heaven. You have been cast out of the spiritual consciousness of the chakras of the spine and the 1,000-petal lotus. Why? Because you had a greater desire for worldly things, that's all. Let us have the desire for God. As he supplies universe upon universe, surely he can supply little you and little me. We do not realize what we have in God. We must have a little more faith in him. Now in the Bhagavad Gita, I think we have a reference here at this time which points out a parallel reference of how we should act and how Jesus acted, and this is what we read. This is the reference or the illustration or the example given by Lord Krishna. Jesus gave the example in our Bible. Lord Krishna gave the example in the Gita, and this is what we read. Whatsoever a great man doeth, that other men also do. The standard he setteth up, by that the people go. Therefore, Master said to me, and he will say to every one of you, let your life be a spiritual example for others to follow, to our one abode of light, our cosmic home, where all will meet who live and do right. Those who make God first in their lives, whose purpose in life is to unite their consciousness with His consciousness, will all have that spiritual treasure, freedom in God, freedom in the one eternal consciousness of God's light. So Krishna says this, if a man does a certain thing and sets up the example, then he says, other men follow him. Now if you are lazy in life and do not carry forth your own obligations, others will follow you, you will set a bad example. Being a true man of renunciation does not mean that you remain idle, does not mean that you throw over your obligations, those who are dependent upon you, and the society which is dependent upon you. You cannot shirk those obligations. That's worse than attachment. And if you set that example, you are going to influence others. Your purpose in life should not be that. But as Lord Krishna says, that is, people who do that, they set a standard. Is the standard what you want? Is the standard to take people toward God, or is it to take them further into delusion of worldly living? These things are very important. Then, finally, Krishna says, as the ignorant act from attachment to action, so should the wise act without attachment. The ignorant people, worldly people, they just act, because the attachment they have lays up within them latent impulses which have to be fulfilled. But the wise see to it that those latent impulses are not laid up within them. And so he says, the wise should act without attachment, desiring the welfare of the world. Let no wise man unsettle the mind of ignorant people attached to action, but acting in harmony with me, let him render all action more attractive. Do not try to change people by pointing out what they should do, but rather by example is the greatest thing. That's why one moon, as the Master used to say, is worth much more than many, many stars. One good person meditating is worth millions of ordinary people following action automatically. So be one of those people whose purpose in life is to follow and know God. He will flow through you. He will make you a shining example, and others will be helped, even if you do not say a word. Does God say much? No. So if you meditate regularly with your purpose in life to be one with Him, He will flow through you. You will not know how, but you will see His hand working. You will see people changed by their contact with you. Why? Because you love God. You have an affection for Him. That's all He wants. He has everything. He does not have that affection which He craves. If He finds it in you, He loves you as much as you can hold, and His great force of love will flow from you to help others. And so, going on just a little bit, as I have pointed out, a man of renunciation is not one who neglects his obligation to his family and to his friends and to his society. No. Master says a man of renunciation is one who works to please God. And when he's not working to please God, he's meditating on God. Does that mean you should neglect those who are dependent upon you? No, that's not renunciation, to sit down and do nothing. That's delusion of the worst kind. But when you do your duty, doing the best you can, No matter what your position in life is, doing that duty the best you can to please God, that's all. And when you're home and have a little time, giving Him a little affection through meditation, that's the purpose of life. That's true renunciation. That doesn't mean you have to go to the mountains. If you can and have no obligations and can go there, that's wonderful. But if you have obligations, fulfill them. Only do it to please God. Then you're safe. And so in conclusion, let us remember that our struggles here, they may be of karmic origin, but they are still for one purpose, and that is to please God. And in pleasing Him, to attain freedom in God. No matter what your karma is, you have laid that up. I have laid mine up. But that doesn't make any difference. If whatever comes to me, whatever karma comes to me, I work at it to please God, that's all, then I will attain freedom in God, the celestial kingdom of His bliss. So will you, so will everyone. So it isn't what you have done, it isn't what is laid up that has to be fulfilled. Personally, I don't want to know what I've laid up. I can imagine, but I don't care. What I want to do is to please God. I don't care what I have to do. Neither do you, if you're sensible and understand it. Because what has been done through the law of cause and effect, because we were born in this conscious dream of God. We forgot God in the state in which we had Him, and because of that, we are bound to this cosmic dream. Therefore, what happens is in the dream, but by the grace of God, each one of us has the ability to get out of this dream. Getting out of this dream in the freedom of God, there is no karma. So, no matter what you have to do, you perhaps think your lot is worse than the next door's lot. Never mind that. Get out of it into the freedom of God, then nothing can touch you. And so that's one of the last points I want to give with you. And the final point is this, that this freedom in God will come through following God's plan, through the devotees of self-realization, following God's plan for them. For what purpose? To please Him, that's all. You and I have been drawn to this path, this wonderful path which the Master has left. All right, our karma's there. We must act that way, otherwise we're not true to the drawing of God, the stirring of God's presence. We must act that way. That's the way we must go. That's natural for us. We must realize that. We must follow the channel, because we have been drawn to this channel through the law of cause and effect. Now we must play our part in this channel. If you want to be a true devotee of self-realization, you must play your part to the best of your ability. That's all. But not for name and fame in the organization, not for any prestige you'll get, but for the sole purpose of pleasing God, carrying out His plan for you as a self-realizationist. That's the first thing we must know. That must be our purpose in life. And so, to perfect ourselves through the techniques which our Master has left us. We wanted this path. God wouldn't have given it to us unless He drew us to it. Therefore, we must be true to it. We must carry out, fulfill the techniques which the Master has left and the meditations, that we obtain communion with God. And attaining communion with God, then we can so act as to have freedom in God. Now that's our purpose. That's the purpose of every self-realizationist, is to follow out to the best of his or her ability God's plan, because you asked for it, I asked for it, and God drew us here. We must realize that. It's very simple. And if you do that, you will have freedom in His great presence, and you will feel His peace and His bliss, because He answered you. And if you do not heed His call, you are not loyal to God. Just the same as in Jesus' time, people were drawn to Him. Why? Because God responded to their call, and they followed Him. In different ages, different rays of God's omniscience come. In our time, our Master came, a channel of God. He listened to you through your soul. He listened to the cries of your soul. He responded. We must be loyal to Him and carry out His play and play our part, which applies to each and every one of us. And if we do this, if we, by following self-realization, we become fit instruments, then God's great light and His love will manifest through us, helping others. Remembering Master's words, you have to take one side, either for evil or for good. But if you take that side with full dependence on God, He will work through you. His divine light and love will flow through you, and others will be lifted. And they, in turn, will have a sincere purpose in life and not just drift along with the tide. They will go against the tide, like all great men go, and all true self-realizationists. They go against the tide of ordinary worldly living, going against the tide. They fulfill the purpose which God wanted them to fulfill, to be spiritual examples, through whom His great light and love will flow, helping others so that all will finally merge in His great kingdom of light, our cosmic home.